The food court was packed the way it only gets on a Saturday afternoon. Every chair scraped back, every table claimed, every corner filled with the noise of families and teenagers and couples who had nowhere better to be. The smell of fried food and sugary drinks hung in the air like a fog. It was the kind of place that made a person feel invisible even when surrounded by hundreds of people. Michael Carter noticed that feeling more than most. He sat at a corner table near the window, his 7-year-old daughter Emma across from him, her small legs swinging freely beneath the chair because they didn't quite reach the floor yet. She was working very seriously on a drawing, her tongue pressed to the corner of her mouth the way it always did when she concentrated, and Michael was watching her the way fathers watch their children when they think nobody is looking. Like she was the only real thing in the room. 2 chairs sat empty at their table. They always left 2 chairs empty. It wasn't something they talked about. It wasn't a rule written anywhere. It was just something that happened naturally, without discussion, the way grief shapes a family's habits so quietly that you don't even notice until a stranger points it out. 1 chair for the ghost of a woman who used to sit there. 1 chair for the possibility that the world might still surprise them. Michael wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and let the warmth travel up through his fingers. Emma looked up from her drawing. "Daddy, is the pizza here yet?" 2 more minutes, bug. She accepted this with great patience and went back to her artwork. Michael watched her for another moment, then turned his gaze toward the crowded room, not looking for anything in particular, just the habit of a man who had learned to stay alert to the world around him ever since he'd become the only parent his daughter had. That's when he saw her. She was standing at the far end of the food court, near the condiment station, holding a plastic tray with both hands and scanning the room with the careful, practiced patience of someone who had learned not to expect things to be easy. She was young, mid-20s, maybe, with dark hair pulled back simply and a worn grey jacket that had seen better winters. Her crutches were tucked under her arms with the ease of long habit, and where her right leg should have been, there was simply nothing below the knee. But it wasn't the missing leg that caught Michael's attention. It was her face. There was a dignity in it that stopped him completely, a quiet, self-contained composure that most people spend their whole lives trying to perform and never quite manage. She wasn't asking for sympathy from the room. She wasn't hoping to be noticed. She was simply standing there, holding her tray, doing the very ordinary human task of looking for somewhere to sit, and doing it with more grace than anyone else in that loud, careless room deserved to witness. Every table was full. Michael watched her eyes move systematically across the food court, row by row, with the efficiency of someone who had done this calculation many times before and already knew how the math usually turned out. A group of teenagers at one table shifted their bags to take up the remaining chairs without even looking up from their phones. A family at another rearranged themselves to block the open seat before she could reach it, not out of cruelty, just out of the absolute ordinary selfishness of people who aren't paying attention. She kept moving, kept scanning. Her tray never wavered. Emma looked up again and followed her father's gaze across the room. Children notice things that adults have trained themselves to overlook. "Daddy," Emma said quietly, with the matter-of-fact clarity that 7-year-olds deliver their most important observations, "that lady can't find anywhere to sit." "I know, bug. We have chairs." Michael looked at his daughter for a moment, really looked at her, and felt something shift quietly in the center of his chest. He thought about how much of who Emma was had been shaped by loss and kindness in equal measure. He thought about her mother, who used to say that the most important things a person could do were almost always the simplest ones, and that people made goodness complicated because they were afraid of how easy it actually was. He set down his coffee cup. He raised one hand. The woman with the crutches had turned slightly, beginning to recalculate, when she caught the movement from the corner of her eye. She looked toward their table. Michael nodded once. Not an elaborate gesture, not a performance, just a simple, steady nod that said, "Yes, here, this is for you," and Emma, not one to let her father have all the moment, patted the empty chair beside her twice with an open palm, the way you'd invite a friend you'd known for years. The woman's careful composure flickered for just a fraction of a second. She crossed the food court toward them. When she reached the table, she stopped and looked at Michael directly, and there was a question in her eyes that went deeper than the words she chose. "Can I sit here?" Her voice was soft, not weak, but careful, like someone who had learned to take up less space than they deserved. Michael didn't just nod this time. He stood up. He pulled the chair out himself, not with a flourish, not with the self-conscious performance of someone doing a good deed for an audience, but simply and quietly, the way you do something when it's just the right thing and there's nothing more to it than that. "Please," he said. "We were hoping someone would join us." 3 words that cost him nothing. 3 words that landed on Sarah Malik like sunlight after a very long winter. She Saturday. She arranged her crutches against the table with practiced ease. She looked down at her tray for a moment, composing herself, because something unexpectedly kind has a way of dismantling the careful architecture a person builds around their heart when they've been carrying something heavy for a long time. And Sarah had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. Emma watched her settle in with the frank curiosity of childhood. Then, without a single word of preamble, she slid her chocolate pudding cup across the table until it sat directly in front of Sarah. Sarah looked at it. Then at Emma. "It's the best part," Emma said seriously. "I'm giving it to you." Something passed across Sarah's face that she didn't have a word for yet, a feeling too large and too tender to name in a food court on a Saturday afternoon, with bad lighting and the smell of pizza in the air. She pressed her lips together, blinked once. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was very steady, and only Michael noticed that her hands weren't. He picked up his coffee cup again and said nothing, because some moments don't need commentary. They just need to be allowed to exist. Emma went back to her drawing, chattering now, about the picture, about the girl in it, about how she was going to have a dog someday and his name was going to be Captain and he was going to be enormous. Sarah listened with the particular attentiveness of someone who hadn't been talked to like a normal person in longer than they cared to count. Not talked at. Not talked around. Talked to. Michael watched his daughter perform the entirely unconscious miracle of making a stranger feel like they belong somewhere, and he thought, not for the first time, that children understand something about human beings that most adults spend their whole lives trying to remember. The pizza arrived. Emma immediately began explaining to Sarah which pieces were the best ones based on a very complex cheese distribution system she had apparently developed over years of careful research. Sarah laughed, a small, surprised sound, like something that had been waiting behind a closed door and finally found it open. Michael looked out the window at the afternoon light falling across the parking lot. He was not a man who believed in accidents. He was not a man who thought the universe was sending him messages in food courts on Saturday afternoons. He was a practical man, a tired man, a man who packed school lunches and attended parent-teacher conferences alone and had learned to fill silences that used to belong to someone else. But sitting there, listening to his daughter negotiate pizza slices with a young woman who had walked into their afternoon looking like she was carrying the whole weight of a story he didn't know yet, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Like the empty chairs at their table had been waiting. Like today was the day something began. He picked up his fork, looked across at Sarah, and smiled, the uncomplicated smile of a man with nothing to prove and no agenda in the world except to get through a Saturday afternoon with his daughter and maybe, just maybe, leave the day slightly better than he found it. Sarah smiled back. And Emma, completely unbothered by the entire emotional gravity of the moment, announced that she needed more napkins and could someone please go get them because her hands were extremely cheesy. The table laughed. All 3 of them. Together, her name was Sarah Malik. She said it simply, the way people introduce themselves when they've almost forgotten that introductions are still something they do, that there are still new people in the world, still first conversations, still moments where a name passes from one person to another like something being carefully handed over. Michael told her his. Emma had already decided names were unnecessary and had moved straight to the important business of showing Sarah every single drawing in her backpack, narrating each one with the focused intensity of a museum curator who had been waiting her whole career for the right audience. Sarah gave each drawing her complete attention. That was the first thing Michael noticed about her, the way she listened. Not politely. Not with the distracted half-presence that most adults offer children because they've forgotten how serious the world of a 7-year-old actually is. Sarah looked at every crayon sun, every lopsided house, every drawing of a dog named Captain who didn't exist yet but clearly would someday, and she responded as though each one mattered. Because to Emma, each one did. Michael watched this and said nothing. He was very good at saying nothing when something important was happening. Sarah was 26 years old. She had grown up in this city, left for college, come back. She worked, or had worked, she paused briefly on that word, as a graphic designer for a small firm downtown. She liked coffee more than was probably healthy. She had opinions about pizza that were largely in agreement with Emma's cheese distribution theory, which Emma received as the highest possible form of intellectual validation. She talked easily, the way people talk when they've been quiet for too long and suddenly find themselves somewhere unexpectedly safe. Michael listened and understood, without being told directly, that the ease of this conversation was not ordinary for her, that she had not sat across from new people and talked like this in a long time. He recognized the particular quality of someone relearning a thing they used to know, the way a person finds their footing on ground that should be familiar but has shifted under them while they weren't looking. He knew that feeling personally. He knew it very well. How long ago? He asked, when Emma had slipped away to the condiment station for more napkins, and they had approximately 90 seconds of adult conversation before she returned with a fistful of napkins and probably a new best friend she'd made in line. Sarah didn't ask what he meant. 18 months, she said. She told him about the accident the way people tell the stories they have told many times before, not because the telling has made it smaller, but because they have built a careful path through it that keeps them from getting lost inside it. A Tuesday evening. A green light. A driver who ran the red. The car spinning. The silence after. Her fiancé's name was Daniel. He had been in the seat beside her. He had held her hand in the ambulance. He had been moved to ICU while she was still in surgery. He had never woken up. He had passed 6 weeks after the accident, quietly, with his family around him, while Sarah was still learning to navigate a world that had fundamentally changed its geometry. She lost her leg. She lost Daniel. She lost, for a long time, the version of herself that had known how to walk into a crowded room and feel like she belonged in it. 18 months. I'm sorry, Michael said. Not as a formality. As a man who understood the specific weight of that particular loss. Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, and nodded once, slowly, in the way that people acknowledge being truly heard rather than merely sympathized with. There is a difference. Most people never learn it. She had learned it the hard way, sitting across from well-meaning faces who offered her sorrow without understanding, comfort without comprehension. Michael's eyes held something different. Emma's mother, he said, before she could ask. 2 years ago. Sarah was quiet for a moment. What was she like? Nobody asked him that anymore. People asked how he was managing. They asked about Emma. They asked practical questions about childcare and schedules and whether he was doing okay, which was a different question entirely from the one Sarah had just asked. He looked out the window at the afternoon light for a moment, because the question deserved a real answer, and real answers sometimes need a breath of space before they can be given properly. She was the kind of person, he said finally, who pulled chairs out for strangers. Sarah went very still. Emma returned with 11 napkins and the news that the lady at the pretzel stand had a dog in her purse and it was the size of a potato and she had asked its name and it was Gerald and this was the greatest thing that had ever happened. The table received this information with appropriate gravity. And then Michael told the joke about the broken pencil. He told it with the completely straight face of a man who had delivered this exact joke approximately 400 times and remained entirely committed to it despite the fact that it had never once landed the way he hoped. No point. Emma covered her face with both hands. Sarah looked at him for 1 full second with an expression of pure, helpless disbelief. And then she laughed. Not the small surprise sound from earlier. A real laugh. The kind that comes from somewhere below the careful composure a person constructs around themselves when they've been through something that rearranges everything. The kind of laugh that doesn't ask permission. It arrived and it was real and it filled their small corner of the food court with something warm and unguarded and entirely alive. Michael grinned. Emma immediately demanded to know why adults always laughed at the bad jokes and never the good ones. They talked for 2 hours. They talked about the city and good coffee shops and a bookstore 3 blocks from Sarah's apartment that had a cat named Professor who slept on the philosophy shelf and seemed to be making a point about something. They talked about Emma's school and her very complicated feelings about mathematics and her absolute certainty about the dog named Captain. Sarah showed Emma how to shade a drawing so it looked like the sun was coming from one direction, and Emma practiced this technique 17 times on 17 different pieces of paper and improved dramatically each time. Michael watched Sarah teach his daughter something and felt the 2 empty chairs at the table quietly, slowly, begin to feel like something other than absence. Not replacement. Nothing like that. Something different. Something that didn't have a clean name yet but sat gently in the chest and asked nothing of him except to notice it. When the afternoon light shifted and Emma announced that she was, extremely officially, completely full, they gathered their trays and their drawings and their coffee cups and stood in the particular way that signals the end of something that wasn't supposed to be this good. Sarah reached for her crutches. Her eyes were bright in a way she clearly hadn't planned on. I'm sorry, she said softly, pressing her lips together, because the brightness was becoming difficult to contain and she was still, even now, someone who apologized for the space her feelings took up in the world. Michael shook his head. Don't be, he said quietly. Emma and I, We know what lonely feels like in a crowded room. Sarah looked at him. He looked back. No performance. No careful management of the moment. Just two people standing in a food court on a Saturday afternoon, recognizing something in each other that they hadn't known they were still looking for. Emma, meanwhile, had taken her favorite crayon, a specific shade of orange she called Sunset, not orange. There was a difference and she would explain it if pressed, and had been working on something with enormous concentration while the adults had their moment. She tugged Sarah's sleeve. She held up a napkin. On it, in crayon, were 3 stick figures standing side by side. The tallest one had a small circle for a head and very serious eyebrows. The shortest one had what appeared to be a cloud of hair and was holding something that might have been a drawing or might have been a pizza slice, artistically ambiguous. The middle one had 2 lines for legs and 2 small marks beneath them, and in Emma's 7-year-old understanding of how to draw a person who uses crutches, this was the most careful and considered detail she had ever put into any artwork. At the bottom, in the large, deliberate letters of a child who has recently learned that words can carry weight. Me. Daddy. New friend. Sarah took the napkin with both hands. She held it for a moment, just looking at it, at the 3 figures standing together, at the letters underneath, at the evidence of a child's entirely uncomplicated decision that Sarah belonged in the picture. She pressed it to her chest. And she wept. Not sad tears. Or not only sad tears. The kind of tears that come when something you stopped believing in quietly walks back into your life through a side door you forgot to lock. The kind that arrive when you realize the world has been secretly building something for you during the long months when it felt like nothing was happening at all. Michael put a hand briefly on her shoulder. Said nothing. Because he knew. Emma wrapped both arms around Sarah's waist and held on. And Sarah held the napkin to her chest, and the afternoon light came through the food court window and fell across all 3 of them and stayed there, warm and unhurried, like it had absolutely nowhere else to be.